Claude responded. The day my son-in-law showed up at my door with a lawyer and a folder full of paperwork, I finally understood why my own father never told a soul about the Mon. The day my son-in-law showed up at my door with a lawyer and a folder full of paperwork, I finally understood why my own father never told a soul about the money he left behind either. My name is Robert Hensley, and for most of my adult life, I was a careful man. Not cheap careful. There's a difference, though my late wife used to tease me that only an accountant could tell them apart. And she wasn't wrong, because that's exactly what I was for 34 years. I balanced other people's books in a small office in Columbus, Ohio, and somewhere along the way I got very good at noticing when numbers didn't add up. I never imagined that skill would end up saving my daughter's future. I should back up. My wife, Diane, passed 6 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say everything you need to say, which I suppose was a mercy, though it never felt like one at the time. We had one daughter together, Megan, and after Diane died, Megan became the center of what was left of my life. She used to call me every Sunday evening, no matter what, just to talk about nothing in particular, her week at the hospital where she worked as a physical therapist, some recipe she was trying, a movie she thought I'd like. Those calls kept me tethered to something after the house got quiet. 2 years ago, my older brother, Walter, died. Walter and I hadn't spoken much in the last decade of his life, an old disagreement about our mother's care that neither of us ever really got past, the kind of grudge two stubborn men can nurse until it calcifies into something neither of them remembers how to put down. He never married, never had kids, and when his will was read, I found out he'd left almost everything to me. Not because we'd made peace. I think, honestly, it was because there was no one else. And blood is a strange, stubborn thing that outlasts even long silences. The number on that estate, once the house sold and the investment settled, came to just over $11 million. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the attorney's office for a long time after I heard that figure. I wasn't happy. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about becoming rich and feeling wonderful about it. I sat there and I grieved a brother I'd lost twice, once to that decade of silence, and once for good. And somewhere in that grief was this uncomfortable knowledge that I now had more money than I would ever need, sitting in accounts, quiet as a held breath. I didn't tell Megan the real number. I told her Uncle Walter had left me a little something, and that I was going to be fine financially. She hugged me and said she was glad, and that was the end of the conversation, at least for a while. I want you to understand I wasn't trying to deceive my own daughter out of some cruel instinct. I'd spent 3 decades watching families come apart over inheritance in ways that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with math. I'd done the taxes for enough families torn in half by a parent's death to know that money doesn't reveal character so much as it removes the mask character usually wears. So I kept it quiet. I moved the bulk of it into a trust with a lawyer I'd known for 20 years, a careful, tight-lipped man named Arthur Kessling, and I went back to my ordinary life. I still drove my 10-year-old Buick. I still clipped coupons out of habit more than need. If you'd looked at me on the street, you would have seen an unremarkable widower in his 60s, and that was exactly the way I wanted it. Then, about a year and a half ago, Megan started dating a man named Craig. I remember the first time she brought him to Sunday dinner. He was tall, well-spoken, had a good haircut and a firm handshake, and he worked or said he worked in what he called investment consulting. Though, whenever I asked a follow-up question, the answer would drift sideways into something vague about helping people optimize their financial futures. I've spent enough of my career around people who actually manage money to know that real professionals talk in specifics. Craig talked in brochures. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. Megan was 31, more than old enough to choose who she loved, and I reminded myself that plenty of good men fumble a first dinner with the father-in-law. So I smiled, I asked polite questions, and I let it go. But it kept happening. Every time Craig came around, the conversation had this way of drifting toward money. Not in an obvious, cartoonish way, he was smarter than that, but in little side doors. He'd ask how retirement was treating me. He'd ask, seemingly out of genuine concern, whether I had someone helping me manage my accounts, whether I'd thought about consolidating everything into one place so it would be easier to track as I got older. He framed it every time as concern for an aging man living alone. And every time, some old instinct in the back of my skull, the same instinct that used to catch a decimal point out of place in a client's ledger, quietly flagged it and filed it away. 6 months after they started dating, Craig proposed. Megan called me in tears of joy, and I want to be clear that in that moment, my worry didn't disappear, but it sat down next to my happiness for her rather than replacing it. I loved my daughter. I wanted her to have the wedding and the marriage and the whole beautiful, complicated life she deserved. I just also happened to be a man who had spent his career watching the small cracks in a story eventually become the whole story. The wedding planning began, and here's where the guilt started to eat at me in earnest. Because Megan and Craig didn't have much money saved, and the wedding they wanted modest by some standards, extravagant by theirs, was going to strain them badly. Megan kept apologizing to me about the cost of things, telling me she and Craig would find a way to make the budget work on their own, that they didn't want to be a burden. I watched my daughter try to shrink her own wedding down to something she thought I could afford without knowing what I actually had, and something in me couldn't stand it. So I did what I suppose only a father sitting on a secret that large could do. I quietly covered nearly all of it. I wired money directly to the venue, to the caterer, to the florist, cutting checks that Megan never saw the full total of. And when she asked how I could possibly manage that on top of everything else, I told her it was some savings and a portion of what Uncle Walter left me. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was just a very small window looking out onto a very large room. Craig's reaction to all this generosity was where my instincts really started screaming. He didn't just thank me, he began, almost immediately, treating me differently. Warmer, more attentive, always finding an excuse to sit next to me at family gatherings, always steering conversation toward what he called protecting the family's financial future together. At Thanksgiving that year, 4 months before the wedding, he brought up, unprompted, whether I had a will, whether it was up to date, whether I'd ever considered setting up something that would make things simpler for everyone once I was gone, his words, delivered with a smile, over pumpkin pie, to a man who was very much still alive and sitting 3 feet away from him. I told myself that night, driving home, that I was reading too much into a nervous, socially clumsy man trying too hard to be liked by his future father-in-law. I told myself this several more times over the following months, the way you tell yourself something you're starting to suspect isn't true. The wedding took place on a warm September afternoon at a vineyard outside of Columbus, and for a few hours that day, I let myself just be a proud father instead of a man quietly carrying the weight of a decision I hadn't yet told anyone about. Megan looked luminous. She cried when I walked her down the aisle, and I cried too. And for those few hours, none of the money mattered at all. I remember thinking, watching her dance with Craig under the string lights, that maybe I really had just been a paranoid old man all along. Maybe grief and money and loneliness had made me suspicious of a perfectly decent man who simply wanted to belong to a family. I believed that, or I wanted to, for almost 3 more months. It was early December when Craig called me directly for the first time without Megan on the line. He said he wanted to take me to lunch, man to man, to talk about something important. I remember sitting across from him at a steakhouse downtown, watching him work up to something through 15 minutes of small talk about football and the Ohio winter, before he finally set down his fork and said he'd been thinking a lot about estate efficiency, and that he'd actually gone ahead and had a document drawn up, a simple one. He assured me, just a power of attorney and a small revision to how certain accounts were structured that would make things so much easier if anything ever happened to me. All I had to do, he said, was sign. He had the folder with him, at lunch, already prepared. I want you to understand what that moment felt like for a man in his 60s who has read 1,000 estate documents in his professional life. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something colder and clearer than fear, the particular stillness of watching a suspicion you'd been holding at arm's length for a year finally walk up and introduce itself by name. I told him I'd need my own attorney to look it over before I signed anything, which is the single most reasonable sentence any person can say about a legal document, and I watched his face do something small and fast before he smoothed it back into a smile and said, of course, no rush. That night, I called Arthur Kessling, my lawyer, and I told him everything: the lunch, the folder, the 18 months of small, strange questions about my finances. Arthur, who had drafted my trust and knew exactly what sat inside it, was very quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said something I've never forgotten. Robert, send me that document before you do anything else. And then I want you to think very carefully about whether your daughter knows what you actually have, because if this man is who I think he might be, she is the one who's going to get hurt worst and last. It took Arthur's office 4 days to go through what Craig had sent over. The power of attorney was real, and it was broad, far broader than what Craig had described at lunch, granting authority that would have let him make significant financial decisions on my behalf, decisions Megan would have had no visibility into at all. Buried in the account restructuring language was a clause that would have consolidated certain trust distributions into a joint account that Craig, not Megan, would have had primary signing authority over. Arthur's exact words to me were that it was dressed up as convenience and functioned as control. But that wasn't the worst part. Arthur's paralegal, running a routine background check as part of due diligence, something Arthur insisted on before I responded to Craig at all, found that Craig had been married once before, briefly, 6 years earlier, to a woman in Cleveland whose family owned a small chain of hardware stores. That marriage had ended after 14 months, around the same time her family's business had gone through what the divorce filings vaguely called financial irregularities. During Craig's brief, informal involvement in its bookkeeping, no charges had ever been filed, nothing had ever been proven. But the pattern sat there on paper, undeniable in its shape even if it was never a crime in the eyes of the law. A man who found families with money, married into them quickly, and positioned himself close to the finances before anything else. I sat with that information for 2 days before I told Megan anything. I want to be honest with you about how hard that was, because by then she'd been married 4 months, and I knew what I was about to do could break her heart in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with trust. I drove to her apartment on a Saturday morning while Craig was at what he called a networking breakfast, and I sat at her kitchen table, and I told her everything. The real number from Uncle Walter's estate, the trust, the lunch with the folder, what Arthur's office had found in Cleveland. I watched my daughter's face go through something I can only describe as a controlled collapse. She didn't scream. She didn't cry right away. She just went very still and very pale, the way people do when the floor they've been standing on turns out to be much thinner than they thought. The first thing she asked me, once she could speak again, wasn't about the money at all. She asked if I thought Craig had ever actually loved her, or if she'd been, from the very beginning, a door he'd found his way in through. I didn't have an honest answer to that question that wouldn't hurt her, so I told her the only true thing I had, that I didn't know his heart, but I knew what the paperwork said. And paperwork doesn't lie the way people can. What Megan did next is, I think, the part of this story I'm proudest of. Prouder even than the money itself, because it would have been so easy for her to feel like a fool and let that feeling curdle into either denial or despair. Instead, she called Arthur's office herself that same afternoon. She asked for copies of everything. She asked hard, specific questions, the kind that told me my daughter, who had spent her whole adult life healing other people's bodies, not untangling legal documents, was thinking with a clarity I hadn't fully given her credit for. She confronted Craig 3 days later, with Arthur's paralegal quietly present as a witness, not to ambush him, but because Arthur insisted it protect her legally, either way this went. Craig's response, when confronted with the Cleveland background and the actual scope of what he'd tried to get me to sign, was to first deny it, then minimize it, then finally, when Megan produced the documents themselves, pivot to accusing her of letting her father poison their marriage. He never once in that entire conversation expressed concern for her feelings. Every single sentence, Megan told me later, was really about the money, dressed up as being about something else. She filed for an annulment within the month on grounds of fraud. Once it became clear the marriage had been entered into, at least in significant part, under false pretenses that a court would recognize. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't painless. There were nights she called me sobbing, not over Craig exactly, but over the version of her own life she'd believed in for a year and a half. I drove over more than once at midnight just to sit with her at that same kitchen table and not say anything useful, because sometimes there isn't anything useful to say. There's just showing up. The annulment was finalized in the spring. Craig moved to Cincinnati, as far as I know, and started, according to Megan's one friend, who still occasionally checked, dating a woman whose family owned a small chain of dry cleaners. I don't know what happened after that, and honestly, I've stopped wanting to know. Megan and I talk every Sunday evening still, the way we always did, except now the calls run longer, and sometimes they're about the actual number in the trust, because I finally told her everything. Every dollar, every account, no more small windows onto large rooms. She didn't want it handed to her, I want to be clear about that, because she made a point, more than once, of telling me she didn't need my money to build a life. She just needed to know she could trust the people standing beside her while she built it. But she also, slowly, let me help her the way I'd wanted to all along, without either of us pretending the money didn't exist. I think often about my brother Walter, about the decade of silence between us that neither of us ever found our way out of before he died, and about how strange it is that his money that came from a relationship broken by pride and stubbornness, ended up being the very thing that protected my daughter from a marriage broken by something worse. I don't know if Walter would have understood what his money did for us in the end. I like to think somewhere he would have. People sometimes ask me, when this story comes up, whether I regret hiding the truth for as long as I did from Megan, from Craig, from nearly everyone. And here's what I've come to believe, sitting with it these last several months. Hiding what you have isn't the same as hiding who you are. I never lied to my daughter about loving her, about being proud of her, about wanting her whole life to be good. I only ever kept one number private, and it turned out that the one number I kept private was the very thing that let the truth about a man's character surface on its own time, instead of being buried under his access to what I had. If you're a parent reading this, sitting on some inheritance or some quiet nest egg you've never told your children the full truth about, I'm not going to tell you what to do, because every family carries its own particular weight. But I will tell you what I told Megan the night everything finally came out at that kitchen table. What's yours doesn't stop being yours just because someone else needs it to be theirs. You're allowed to protect it. You're allowed to watch quietly and wait and let people show you who they are before you hand them the keys to anything that took a lifetime, or in my case, a lost brother, to build. I still drive the same 10-year-old Buick. I still live in the same house Diane and I bought 30 years ago. Nothing about my life looks any different from the outside, and that's exactly how I want it to stay. But every Sunday evening now, when Megan calls, there's nothing sitting quietly between us anymore. No held breath, no small window, just a father and a daughter, and the truth, finally, taking up all the room it always deserved. Claude responded, "Money never shows you a person's heart, it just holds up a mirror and waits. Money never shows you a person's heart, it just holds up a mirror and waits. What protects the people we love isn't secrecy itself, but patience. Watching quietly, trusting slowly, and letting truth surface in its own time instead of handing someone the keys before they've shown you who they really are. Sometimes the wisest kind of love is simply refusing to look away." A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lessons still found its way to your heart.